The Indianapolis Colts defense had their best performance of the season last week when it mattered the most, but was that enough to keep Gus Bradley going into next season? Let's get to it.
You are Locked On Colts, your daily Indianapolis Colts podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Thank you all for tuning in and making us your first listen of the day. This is your daily podcast covering your Indianapolis Colts, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. This episode is brought to you by Prize Picks. Go to prizepicks.com/lockedonnfl and use code all lowercase lockedonnfl to win $50 instantly when you play $5. Hello, everyone. My name is Zach Hicks, your resident film nerd over at horseshoehuddle.com. Today, we are talking all about Gus Bradley, the Colts defensive coordinator. We're going to talk about the final verdict, if he should stay, if he should go, what we think the Colts ultimately do. I'm also going to make the case for why he should stay and also make the case for why he should be fired this offseason. So let's start with the case against Gus Bradley, why the Colts should ultimately make that move at defensive coordinator. And I think this is one where the numbers kind of speak for themselves when it comes to Gus Bradley. We're in year 3 with him being the defensive coordinator. He's had continuity at a lot of positions now. Defensive line has been very much the same faces there. Kwity Paye, Dio Dangbo, DeForest Buckner, Grover Stewart, Tyquan Lewis. I mean, these are guys that have been in his system for all 3 of these seasons now. And the pass rush has never really been at a point where you could say it's above adequate. It's always been at the same level. I know they had a little bit higher sack output last year, but the pressure rate, the QB hit rate, it's never really been at a point where you really want it to be for your defense. So even with continuity at defensive line, continuity at the linebacker core, continuity at, the secondary, I know they've been pretty young the last 3 years, but it's been, a lot of guys who have either grown up in this system or have been in this system their whole career. And we haven't seen the production from this Colts defense. They've consistently struggled against the pass all 3 seasons. The turnovers outside of this year really haven't been a thing for this defense. And even this year, we've seen the run defense kind of corrode compared to years past, where that's at least been one area they've been pretty strong. So consistently in the bottom 5 to 10 for most defensive stats over the last 3 years, that's typically not an area that you want to live in as a defensive coordinator. Obviously, we're currently in an era of very strong defensive performances and very strong defense outputs compared to offenses. And the Colts defense has consistently been, outside the top 15, outside the top 20 in this past 3-year span with Gus Bradley. So it is kind of hard to make that case more clear than that right there. Like, that is kind of the case for firing him, where something needs to change. What you're getting from the defense these last couple years can't be the standard. You want to be more in that top 15, top 10, top 5, dare I say, kind of range as a defense, especially when you have an offensive play caller as your head coach. You want to be able to have that fluidity at defensive coordinator. If it's not working, to be able to move on to another face. So I think that's ultimately just always going to be the biggest case against Gus Bradley, is like the production's not there. And the NFL is very much a what have you done for me lately type of league. I know there have been some good output games this season and good moments over the last 3 years with Gus Bradley, but overall, when you look at look at it all in the totality, it's just not been a great output from this defense with Gus Bradley, regardless of the talent that he's been given, which we'll talk about in the next segment there. But yeah, there's also been a little bit of a stagnant development of young players, especially on the defensive line. Kwity Paye has not really ever taken that big jump that the Colts drafted him to, ultimately be. Dio Dangbo has never taken that big jump. The linebacker room is kind of the same it's been since, the last 3 years. And even in the secondary, like, we'll talk about the secondary in the next segment, how I think he's done a good job of getting productive play out of those guys. We haven't seen anybody really climb past just productive at best. So for a team that prioritizes draft and develop, we haven't seen strong development from this team in years. You could make a case that, like, Nick Cross has gone from an unplayable safety to a decent, strong safety. Jalen Jones from a former 7th-round pick to a good starting outside corner. But aside from that, where have been the big developmental wins on this defense? I don't think the Colts really have any. And that's not the biggest thing that you really want to put on your defensive coordinator, but I do think when you have a team that approaches roster building from draft and develop, you want to see more development. And if you're not going to hold the GM accountable, then you got to hold somebody accountable. And the defensive coordinator and his coaching staff definitely fits the bill of someone that you want to hold accountable for it. And then getting just to Gus Bradley's overall system and scheme, I don't think his scheme is as bland as what people put it as. I think he's actually done a good job over the years of growing a little bit compared to what he was when he first came here in 2022. But I do think there is credence to the argument that, again, in a too high league or a league that does a lot of disguise coverage and even does a good chunk of man coverage nowadays in today's NFL, with Gus Bradley, you kind of know what you're getting. You're getting a bit softer zone. Either you're going to get, Tampa 2 type coverage, or you're going to get cover 3. You're not going to get a lot of disguising before the snap. And it's just kind of a stagnated defense. So, I don't think that this is a defense that can't work, but it is certainly not up there with the innovative minds of like a Brian Flores in the league, or what you're seeing in Seattle with McDonald, or what you're seeing with Minter with the Chargers. You're not seeing the creativity on defense that you are with other teams around the league. And I could see the Colts wanting to branch out to more of a creative mind for their defense. There's nothing really wrong with being a static defense that kind of just excels in their certain areas, but for that to work, you have to be a super well coached, just overall unit that plays like a good unit, that doesn't miss tackles and understands their assignments perfectly. And when we look at Gus Bradley over the last 3 seasons, we've seen too many coverage busts and too many coverage mistakes and missed tackles and poor fundamentals from a team that you really need your fundamentals to be perfect if you're going to operate within this defensive system. You can get away with poor fundamentals at times with a Brian Flores type defense because you're muddying the water so much pre-snap that opposing quarterbacks will make more mistakes against you. Where with Gus Bradley's defense, you need to be so strong in your fundamentals and your knowledge of the scheme that even if the quarterback knows where he has to go with the ball, those 1,000 paper cuts of the quarterback having to dump it down constantly and his players just getting hit for 2-yard gains over and over again will eventually lead to the offense making mistakes. But what you're seeing with Colts and Gus Bradley over the years is the Colts are not being strong in their fundamentals. They're not being strong in their tackling. They're not forcing quarterbacks into those mistakes. A little bit more this season, but still overall over the past 3 seasons. And that's why this defense has struggled compared to Gus Bradley's contemporaries around the league. So again, I think it ultimately just comes down to, in this era where defenses are winning games for teams, like, again, you look at like the Vikings, for instance, there have been some games this year where Sam Darnold has not been great for their offense, but they've been able to win games because that defense has been so dominant in a lot of outings. And kind of what you see with Gus Bradley and his defense is, regardless of opponent, they're going to play hard, but they're going to allow a good chunk of points no matter who they're playing. It could be the inept Patriots offense, or it could be the Detroit Lions. They might only allow like 24 points to both those offenses, but they won't ever like hold down an opposing offense to give your team like a clear, decisive victory. And I think that's where you ultimately look at it with this Colts team. And if you're going to make a change, that's what it comes down to. It's like you just want to see better output from this defense, regardless of who the talent is on that defense. And your defensive coordinator is the guy that makes sense to hold accountable. So I think the argument just kind of comes down to that. I don't think there's really much more that goes into it. It's, if you want to just shake things up on defense and go with a different type of style that's not so static, then yeah, I think you move on from Gus Bradley this offseason. But coming up, guys, that was the case for firing Gus Bradley. What's the case for keeping Gus Bradley? Is there really a case to get 4 years of Gus Bradley here in Indianapolis? But first, get ready to tackle the NFL action with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook, because right now new customers can bet $5 and get $150 in bonus bets if you win. The FanDuel Sportsbook app gives you everything you need to place live bets on NFL all in one place. So when you get a hunch in the middle of a game, you can check out the latest stats, view live play-by-play, and so much more on the same page where you place your bets. FanDuel has the Colts as 3.5-point home favorites with a total point over under a 42.5 this Sunday. So make sure you're going to FanDuel and betting the under on those points for sure. It's going to be a low-scoring game, I think. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. You'll get started with $150 in bonus bets if you win your first $5 bet. FanDuel.com. Never waste a hunch and make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sportsbook partner of the NFL. And guys, it's that time of year. The college football playoff is back, and with the newly expanded 12-team playoff format, it's guaranteed to be bigger and better than ever, bringing you all the hard-hitting and high-flying excitement that you all love. TNT Sports coverage of the college football playoff begins December 21st, starting with the college football playoff kickoff show presented by AT&T at 11 a.m. Eastern Time, leading into our first matchup, the SMU Mustangs battling the Penn State Nittany Lions at noon. Then the Clemson Tigers look to upset the Texas Longhorns in a showdown at 4 p.m. Eastern. Don't miss a moment of the action. Watch College Football Playoff presented by Allstate live on TNT, True TV, TBS, and Max. All right, Locked On Colts everydayers, we are back and making the case for keeping Gus Bradley for a fourth season. Now, I know this will not be a popular case, and I want you guys to stay with me during this segment. I'm pleading with you guys to stay with me because I feel like I can make a decent case, a very adequate case for keeping Gus Bradley. Ultimately, you'll hear in my final segment what I actually think should happen, what I think will happen. But here's the case for keeping Gus Bradley. In the biggest game of the entire season, a season that has been marred by inconsistency on both sides of the ball, mistakes left and right by this entire team, poor quarterback play, poor coaching, you name it. I mean, this has just been an insane season for the Indianapolis Colts. But in the biggest game of the year, against an offense run by Sean Payton that has just been like built to beat this Colts defense, Gus Bradley came out with a really strong game plan, had his defense flying and just operating on all cylinders, and they held a pretty decent, like not a great, but a decent Broncos offense to under 200 total yards and three interceptions in that game. I know it kind of fell apart a little bit late, but the Colts had a good chance to win this football game with one of the best called games I've seen of Gus Bradley. And again, this was like a playoff game, and Gus Bradley came out and had his guys playing. And we've seen it multiple times this season where, yes, you could complain with Gus Bradley about how his defense has performed against some underwhelming offenses like the Bears offense to a degree and stuff like that. Like, I do think there is some argument there. But we've seen at times this year that this defense has come out against good offenses and played some good football. I would say against the Bills, they gave the Colts offense a good enough chance to win that game. Joe Flacco just didn't agree, obviously. But the Colts defense played well against the Bills. I think against the Lions, it wasn't their best performance, but it certainly wasn't their worst. Holding the Lions to 24 points this year is a pretty massive win, considering what the Lions are doing to pretty much everyone else. You look at what this defense did against the Vikings on prime time. I thought they played very, very good football, especially in the first half of that game. And then again, this past week against the Denver Broncos, it was one of their best performances in years. So Gus Bradley has gotten his side of the ball to really step up and play some good ball, when needed this year in big time matchups. And I think there is reason to praise that when it comes to Gus Bradley. Overall, when you look at him as a coach too, like I mentioned a little bit in the first segment, I think he has shown some growth and some improvement at times. When he first came in here, they were very much a cover 3 match type of team. Like, they lived in cover 3, ran a lot of single high and match. Now they had better cornerbacks who could do that, obviously back then in 2022, but they basically lived in that match cover, that cover 3 match coverage. And what we've seen to the personnel he has on defense, it hasn't been this full scale change where he's coming out in like straight up man coverage or anything like that. But we've seen more cover 2 usage. We've seen more cover 4 usage. We've seen more blitzing at times, especially against better opponents, just to get something going with his defense. We have seen Gus Bradley change a little bit. And I think that's worthy of some praise. Maybe it's only worthy of praise because he was so static early on in his tenure with the Colts, but I do want to send him some praise and some compliments for how he has changed a little bit over the last couple seasons. And then I think there is a good argument to say too with Gus Bradley's unit is in the 3 years he's been with the Colts, his side of the ball has been the better side of the ball in 2 of those 3 seasons. And I'm not saying that he shouldn't be held accountable for the defense not being great, but I still think maybe there's bigger issues with this Colts team than maybe his side of the ball if his unit keeps outperforming the other side with not as great talent either. And that's kind of my other argument here is when you look at what he was given going into this season, I mean, yes, the defensive line on paper looked pretty good and they've underperformed relative to what you expected. But at linebacker, at corner, at safety, what was he supposed to do with the guys he had at those positions? I mean, we're not talking about world beaters here. He doesn't really have much star talent on defense aside from DeForest Buckner. He had to make it work with 2023 seventh round pick at outside corner and then a waiver wire pickup at the other outside corner spot, plus a safety they brought back on a $3 million contract, and then another safety who hadn't played a defensive snap in 3 years. Like, he wasn't really rolling out like a bunch of veteran starters or a star player in the secondary. And to a degree, it's kind of been fine this year. Sam Womack has been a very solid outside starting corner. Jalen Jones, he has his good moments and his bad moments, but overall is a solid outside corner number 2. I think Nick Cross has had the best season of his career. So we were really down on this safety group and this corner group coming into the year and how this was going to cost the Colts their season. And I think when you stack up all the issues with the Colts season this year, do corner or safety play really make it in the top 5 or the top 10 even? Like, there's a lot more issues with this team than the cornerback or the safety room. And I do think that's because of Gus Bradley changing the defensive system a little bit, working with the guys he had, and developing these guys into being, adequate starters. Now, again, there is an issue with the draft and development system where you're not developing guys into stars, but to take players who the rest of the NFL were not very high on, or guys who were, left by the wayside, and turning them into quality NFL players, that's still pretty good from a defensive coordinator standpoint. Maybe it's not where you need to be to get, a great roster, obviously, but it's enough to make a high floor roster, and why the Colts are more of an average team than an awful team. So I do think there are some arguments for Gus Bradley. I think he's been the better of the coordinators this season. I think his unit's been the better of the 2 units this season. I think he's gotten some good play out of Sam Womack and Jalen Jones and Nick Cross that he deserves some credit for. And I think he's changed up a lot of what he's done over the last couple of years. Not a ton, but incrementally, he's gotten his defense to being a little bit more diverse, a little bit more blitzy, a little bit more cover 2 and cover 4. And I want to give him some credit for that. So, yeah, you'll hear my final segment. I'm not going to say that we should keep Gus Bradley because of these positive things, but there is an argument for him. And honestly, to top it all off with one more thing here, when the Colts ultimately make their decisions to change some things up this offseason because they missed the playoffs for the 4th straight year and yada, 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 that somebody has to be held accountable for it, I don't think it's right for Gus Bradley to be the potential scapegoat just because he's the easiest one to fire. I think if all these guys, if Shane Steichen and Chris Ballard and everyone else on the staff gets one more year to right the ship, why not Gus Bradley? Why not Gus Bradley gets to just stick it out for one more year too? Why does he have to be the guy who goes compared to all the other ones? Now, again, if you fire everyone, that's fine. And Gus Bradley goes, he goes. But if Gus Bradley is the only one you fire, why him? He's got a better case to stay than the other 2. That's kind of my final point with making the case for keeping Gus Bradley. So let me know what you think in the comments section if with the case for Gus Bradley, and if it's a strong one by any means there. But coming up, we're going to talk about the final verdict, what I would ultimately do, what I think the Colts ultimately do, and if it is the right decision. Today's episode is sponsored by Prize Picks. If you love watching the game, you're going to love Prize Picks, the easiest and most exciting way to play daily fantasy. Whether it's football, basketball, or any of your favorite sports, Prize Picks makes your holidays bigger and brighter. You can now win up to 1,000 times your money on Prize Picks. Plus, this holiday season, they're giving away $30+ million in rewards during Picksmas and offering 2 free picks in December. And when your picks hit, Prize Picks makes it easy to cash out. You can get your money in just as fast as 15 minutes. This week, I'm looking at Jared Goff for more than 230 passing yards and Saquon Barkley for more than one touchdown. I'm in my fantasy football semifinals, and that would be awesome if Barkley could hit more than one touchdown. It's quick, simple, and so much fun to challenge myself and my friends. Download the PrizePicks app today and use code LOCKEDONNFL to get $50 instantly after your first $5 lineup. That's right, $50 instantly when you play just $5. PrizePicks this season. Rocket Money has over 5 million users and has saved a total of $500 million in canceled subscriptions, saving members up to $740 a year when using all of the app's premium features. For me, one of the best features is the subscription tracker. I've used it to cancel services I wasn't using before, and I've already saved a ton. Plus, with their goals feature, I've been able to automatically set aside money for my future. No more stressing out budgeting every single month. It is clutch as it gets. Cancel your unwanted subscriptions and reach your financial goals faster with Rocket Money. Go to rocketmoney.com/lockedon today. That's rocketmoney.com/lockedon today. rocketmoney.com/locked-on. All right, Locked On Colts every day as we're back talking all about Gus Bradley. We made the case for why he should be fired. We made the case for why he should stay. Now, ultimately, what is the verdict? Now, if it's my personal opinion, again, we've seen 3 years of Gus Bradley at this point. I don't think it's been all bad from him. But for me personally, I do think I would move in a different direction than Gus Bradley this offseason. Again, this is not a firing out of spite or hatred. I think Gus has been the better of the coordinators over the past couple years for the Colts. And I think his volatility is a lot more contained than what we've seen on offense this season. But ultimately, I do think again, in a world where defensive supremacy is big right now, and we are seeing really strong defensive output from other teams and even some teams that are doing even more with less. I mean, you look at that Vikings defense, there's not many stars on that Vikings defense, and they're still making it work because the unit is playing more in control, and they just have more of a diverse defensive attack. I do just kind of dream of a better defense, I guess, in that way. And in a sense, Gus Bradley's kind of like the Chris Ballard of defensive coordinators, in the sense where, you're going to have a decent floor where you could move on from Gus Bradley and end up with someone much worse, but also you could move on from Gus Bradley and get someone so much better. So I do think ultimately I would move on from him. I would look for someone from the Ravens tree, from that 2023 Baltimore Ravens tree under Mike Macdonald, and really kind of approach defensive scheming from that way. A little bit more blitz heavy, a little bit more man, a little bit more diverse pre-snap. I think that would be good for this overall defense. Now, what do I think? What do I think the Colts ultimately do? I think they fire Gus Bradley as well, and I think that he's going to be the lone coaching change they make this offseason. And again, I have an issue with that. I do have an issue with it only being Gus Bradley, because you can't tell me that the issues this season have primarily been on defense, or it's just been the defense's fault or the defensive coordinator's fault. I just can't buy that. I won't buy going into next season with the same roster in place and maybe one free agent brought in a new draft class, all from the same general manager and the same head coach, but with just a defensive coordinator change. I'm not going to buy that things are going to be better. I think we'll see pretty much the exact same team next year. Maybe a little bit better defensive output because there is, a little bit more potential with this unit. But ultimately, I do think that there needs to be more talent on this defense. I think there needs to be better players brought in for the defensive coordinator and more players that are more bought into a system for the next defensive coordinator. So, yeah, ultimately, I think I would agree when the Colts fire Gus Bradley. I will agree with the decision, but not with him being the only one gone. I do think the general manager probably needs to go. Maybe the head coach too. Maybe the head coach if you're already making the other changes. But yeah, Gus Bradley, I think as a scapegoat is a gross miscalculation by this team. But Gus Bradley ultimately being fired in, like a nutshell, I think does make some sense. If that makes sense to you guys, if you understand what I'm saying here. I don't think Gus Bradley's done enough to keep his job, but I think he's done enough to not just be the only guy at fault for this season. But overall, Gus Bradley's been fine. I really don't have too many issues with Gus Bradley. I just don't have many compliments or wins with him either. I think there is potential for more on this defense, regardless of the talent that he's been given in the secondary. I think he's done a good job with the secondary. I think he's done a poor job with the defensive line. And that's where we're at right now. We have a below average defense statistically, maybe a bit more average when you watch the games on Sundays with some really high highs and some low lows. They come out for the big games. They let down in the weaker games. I mean, I do think there is a better future for this Colts defense, but I don't think Gus Bradley's terrible by any means. I think he's done a good job over the past couple of years, but it probably is time to just make that change. It's been 3 years of much of the same. We're not seeing too much of a change in terms of overall output from the defense. So it probably is time to make that change from Gus Bradley. I just hope he's not the only one gone, because there's a lot more people at fault than just Gus Bradley and maybe a couple players for what happened to the Colts this season. But you guys let me know in the comment section below. Do you think it's time to finally move on from Gus Bradley? Or do you think he deserves one more chance like the rest of these guys involved with the Colts? I don't want to say success, the Colts season in 2024. Do you think he gets one more year with Shane Steichen and Chris Ballard? Let me know in the comment section. And let me know also some defensive coordinators that you would like to see the Colts go after. You know, what teams you want brought over here, what kind of systems. I think that could be a really fun future conversation if the Colts ultimately do move on from Gus Bradley. So let us know in the comment section who you would eye as the next defensive coordinator for the Colts if you'd make that change from Gus Bradley. I do want to thank you guys for making Locked On Colts your first listen today and every day, though. Next, go find Locked On NFL. First, the madman Tyler Rowland kicks off your morning with a double shot of NFL espresso, and then stop by the barbershop with Tony Wiggins for some real NFL talk. Find Locked On NFL on YouTube or listen to your podcast. And if you guys want to become a Locked On Colts insider and chat with us directly and get that insider scoop, follow the link in our show notes. And if you don't already, make sure you're following at Locked On Colts, at Jake Arthur NFL, and at Zach Hicks 2, all on Twitter. Also, subscribe to us on YouTube or listen to your podcast. We love you guys' ratings and reviews, and we'll catch you guys back here tomorrow afternoon for Crossover Thursday. Yeah, there's a game playing Sunday, and we got Crossover Thursday.